Okay, nice. So welcome everybody to this new seminar from NetPlace. Today we will have Max Falkenberg. Max is a physicist and a computational social scientist. He's based in the University of London. As we were discussing, he will join CU in October. And his research focuses on computational social science, and in particular, he is interested in political polarization. So thank you, Max, for accepting being here today, and I'll leave you the floor.
Great. Thank you very much for the invitation. And yeah, let me just share my screen. And you can see my screen okay? All good?
Yeah. Nice.
Okay, great. Okay, so hello everyone. Thanks for joining for the talk, and thank you for the invitation. As was mentioned, so I'm Max Falkenberg. I'm currently a postdoc at City University of London, and I want to give you a slightly weird talk today, which I'm going to go through a format that I think is not so typical, which is that I'm going to tell you a bit about work I've been doing in the last couple of years, and then I will tell you why it's crap. I will tell you why my own research, is not so good, and what I've learned in the last couple of years about the difficulties entering a new field when you come from a very specific perspective and you're not necessarily familiar with the material you're covering. So, so just a little bit about me. I'm from London. I grew up down here in Southwest London, and I've spent pretty much my whole life in this, satellite image here. I spent eight years at Imperial College. I did my master's and my PhD in physics at Imperial in complex systems. And currently I'm split between City University, where I mainly work in computational social science, but I also am based at the Institute for Sustainable Resources at UCL, where I do a lot of work on climate finance. I don't mention any of that today, but if you're interested in networks of climate finance, I can talk about that a bit later. And yeah, as I mentioned, I'll be joining CEU in October this year. So I was very lucky. I got Marie Curie Research Fellowship a few months ago. So I'll be joining CEU for 2 years. And I think the plan for the discussion after this talk is to talk a little bit about fellowship applications. And in particular, I want to give an extremely cynical take on fellowship applications and why you might also benefit if you write a fellowship application for being extremely cynical about it yourself. Anyway, so that's a little bit about me. And during the sort of 8 years I spent at Imperial, I worked on all sorts of different things, which is quite common for, a complex systems person. I spent some time working on insect biology, doing models of how insects build traps. I spent a long time collaborating with cardiologists in agent-based models and cellular automata models of electrical signals in the heart. I enjoyed this for a while and then rapidly stopped enjoying it. But I can talk about that some other time. And then I spent a lot of time interested in network growth models, but specifically I've always been interested in how time is forgotten about when we talk about static networks. So these are all things I worked on during my PhD and my master's. But since 2021, most of the work I've been doing is in computational social science. So there's this, seminal article from 2009 with a whole bunch of big names in it. And it's, the idea of computational social science is not so crazy. It basically covers, if you can call it social science and you happen to have used a computer at some point in your analysis, it probably comes under this category. But I thought I'd show this article because even in this really early case of computational social science, there was this nice example of this network of links between political blogs in the US. And this was sort of, you know, one of the earliest examples of how network science and computational scientists can contribute to traditional social science in discussions around polarization, for instance, and spreading patterns and political communication. And, you know, since this was first published in 2009, this image being taken from an earlier article by Lada and Adamek in 2004, this idea of focusing on networks representative of polarization has really not changed at all. It's as big as it was 20 years ago, and you know, as long as we keep on getting data, it's going to stay pretty big. So that's, you know, kind of what I do these days. Since 2021, I've been working on computational social science. And, you know, there's a hell of a lot of things you can be working on when you're doing computational social science, but generally, there's always, you know, a core set of issues that, you know, members of the public and researchers spend most of their energy thinking about. And I thought this was a nice, you know, report to highlight. They asked a bunch of policymakers at Davos at the World Economic Forum about, you know, what are the biggest global risks facing us in the short and medium term. And the interesting things is, you know, common themes that came out were these ideas of misinformation, disinformation, and polarization, political communication, and how that can be manipulated to negative societal consequences, but also a lot of stuff, especially in the longer term, to do with climate change. So these are sort of, you know, areas that a lot of researchers and members of the public are focusing on. And this is also what was the case when I started my postdoc in 2021. So one of the earliest things we started working on is this idea of, can we do a study talking about online polarization in the context of climate change? And the question is, yeah, in principle, we could do that, but if we're going to do that, it matters to think about, well, what actually is polarization in this context? And, you know, I'm a network scientist. My boss is a network scientist. Most of the people we work with are network scientists. So to us, the idea of, you know, polarization very intuitively maps to this network science representation of polarization. You have individuals who are represented as nodes. They interact with other individuals in some kind of social network. These days, in the 2020s, we think of this on social media, but, you know, the idea of social networks existed long before social media did, and this idea of political interaction networks is nothing new. So this to us, from a network science perspective, is very intuitive. And not only can we identify structures which, in a sense, make sense to us as being a polarized network structure, but we can also think of specific mechanisms at play which are involved in building these networks and sustaining these networks over time. So this is the natural sort of network science perspective on political polarization. And then we wanted to, you know, take this to the context of climate change. So one of the things we started doing in 2021 is that there was the COP climate summit in Glasgow in the UK. So we said, okay, can we use Twitter data and see how are people interacting about climate change and about the COP summits online. So we did what, you know, network scientists usually do. We got some data, we constructed a network from it. In this case, we constructed a retweet network where we made this assertion that a retweet is equivalent to an endorsement. I know many people online say retweets are not the same as endorsements, but to be honest, most of those people are lying. There's a lot of evidence to suggest they really are indicative of endorsements. And what was nice is when we looked at this network, we could identify that there was this core community of individuals who were engaging positively with COP and were supporting discussions in favor of climate action. But we also identified this sort of community of climate skeptics on the site. And the people active in this community came from a few different backgrounds. There were a sort of minority of users who were, very specialized in the climate space and pushed back very, very hardly against climate action. But then actually the majority of people in this community were just figures from the political right and the alt-right, people who are skeptical of all sorts of kind of government interventions. There was some overlap in 2021 with people who were skeptical of COVID restrictions and mask restrictions. So those were the kind of things we identified. But it's all well and good, finding a network and drawing it and identifying these communities. We wanted to make this something that could be relevant from a policy perspective. So we wanted to find a way of formally measuring the divide between these communities. And what we did was to convert this retweet network into a bipartite network where we focus on a specific set of influential accounts who anchor this conversation and a set of accounts who interact with those influential actors. And then the reason we did this is then if you use a little bit of, relatively basic linear algebra, you can convert this network representation into a one-dimensional distributions of like pseudo opinions. So we can say if this is a distribution of ideological views on climate change, well, then there is a majority view group of individuals, and they express generally positive views on climate action. And then you have this minority group who in general are skeptical of climate action. Now, it gets a little bit more complicated when you start looking at the narratives, but long story short, one of the nice things was, you can take this network representation and you can map it to something that is, makes sense to a social scientist interested in polarization. As I say, I'm not going to talk about the maths. If you're interested in the methods behind this, my good friend and co-author Ale Galeazzi actually spoke about these methods at a different NetPlace seminar in January. So I saw it a couple of days ago, so it's still online if you're interested in that. But essentially, the idea is to basically create this ordering of influences and look at, where along some one-dimensional spectrum individuals lie. So this in itself, this one-dimensional spectrum of ideological views is nothing particularly special. But one of the benefits of using this network science perspective and the reason for splitting this network into a set of influential accounts and accounts who interact with those accounts is that you can change who you select as your influencers. And one of the things we did was to really separate out how politicians interact with the COP discussion from how other accounts, mainly climate activists, interact with discussion. And basically, by doing this process twice and by looking at the same set of users in both ideological distributions, we were basically able to match these users into a two-dimensional spectrum. And that looks a little bit like this. So we could map users along how they interacted with politicians in the COP discussion and how they interacted with other kind of accounts who were active in the climate discussion. And when you do that, you can see that generally liberal politicians and most mainstream parties were aligned with this majority group on climate policy and related COP, but that there was also this set of conservative political politicians, right-wing political politicians who were active in this discussion and who were opposing the COP process and opposing climate action. And by using this network perspective, not only can we identify these politicians and put a specific political party at a specific point in this spectrum. So for instance, this letter K here is the Canadian Conservative Party. J is the Brexit Party or UKIP Party in the UK. You have the Republican Party in the US. And then you have a large number of other political parties from the UK, US, Canada, and Australia down here. so this was interesting. We were able to do this, and we were also able to do some topic modeling so that we could say where specific narratives existed within this two-dimensional spectrum. But the result, which was, the headline result for us, was actually that when we started repeating this analysis, not just for COP26, which was in 2021, but repeating this analysis for all the previous COP summits over many years, what we found is that previously we only really had climate activists active in this discussion, with the exception of a very small number of small scale but active climate skeptics. But we're talking, this is 300 accounts, and this is 3 out of 300. So 1% of accounts having climate skeptic views during COP21, and that this really increased substantially. So 1 in 6 accounts during COP26 were engaging with climate skeptic narratives. And we could measure this formally using some bimodality statistics. And our interpretation was that this was evidence that the discussion around climate politics and the COP summits had become polarized. So that was very nice. We published this in end of 2022, and it's done very well for itself, and it's done very well for me. But one thing that was pointed out to us while this paper was reviewed, and we didn't take it so seriously at the time, but the more time has passed since, and the more I've thought about it, I've thought, well, is what we measured, is it really accurate to say what we are measuring is polarization or some form of political polarization of climate change? And this sounds like a relatively straightforward question initially, but it turns out that this question gets very difficult very quickly. So if you go to Wikipedia and you look at what political polarization is apparently on Wikipedia, it talks about the divergence of political attitudes away from the center and towards ideological extremes. So in a sense, that's something we measured. We saw, that a community of climate skeptics had diverged away from this mass of pro-climate narratives online. But what was not necessarily clear is, well, have these opinions become more extreme? Do these identities, climate skeptics and climate activists, can we actually say something about the extremity of their views on climate change? And even supposing we can really do that, well, what are we actually measuring? And is what we are measuring a fair representation of polarization? So for instance, if you have a look at this very interesting paper by Aaron Bramson and colleagues, what they show in this paper is if you just take a bimodal distribution, so this is a one-dimensional distribution with two main peaks, which is already extremely simplified. Most political issues exist in more than one dimension. There's usually more than two peaks in a distribution of opinions, especially if you go outside the US. But ignoring that for a moment, assuming a one-dimensional distribution is sufficient, assuming you only have 2 peaks, well, even in that simple instance, there are all sorts of different ways we can compare 2 distributions and say, is this polarization, is this distribution or that distribution more or less polarized? So for instance, in this example, instead of looking at the position of the peaks of the distribution, here they just looked at the spread of the distribution. So in this case, distribution B has more extreme views than distribution A, even though the position of the peaks of these distributions, the modal opinions, haven't changed. And then you have other examples. So you have cases where the 2 peaks of the distribution are narrower, and by being narrower, the gap between the 2 distributions is more pronounced. So in a sense, we can say here that distribution B is more polarized than A, but it is used in a different sense than how we mean it in the first case. And I'm not going to go through all the different cases, but in this paper, one of the things they show is that there's roughly 12 different intuitive ways you can define what it means to be more or less polarized. And across these 12 different definitions, it is possible to increase and decrease polarization in one definition without actually affecting any of the other 11 definitions. And the reason I'm highlighting this is that these kind of ambiguities are so often neglected by polarization researchers in general, but especially by computational social scientists and network scientists who have a habit of just taking a network-based perspective on this and forgetting the nuance that can come into these discussions when you approach these discussions from a social science perspective. So this is just one set of issues, but actually this whole discussion gets a whole lot more complicated when you realize that actually political polarization isn't even really one concept. This is just, please don't spend your whole time reading this now. I'm generally opposed to big blocks of text, but this is just sort of a taxonomy from a paper I'm currently working on. And there are many different ways you can define political polarization. And depending on what you are measuring and what you claim to measure, there are very different interpretations for what is actually happening in your system. So the kind of forms of polarization that we find very intuitive is something like ideological polarization. So this is the gap between having the gap in the population between being on the political left and political right. Issue polarization is essentially the equivalent idea, but about specific issues. So specifically about climate change, specifically about Brexit in the UK, specifically about the European Union. And most of the time these two concepts are aligned with each other, but there's many cases where they're not. There's many cases where you have people on the political right who are pro-climate action, and you have cases of people who are on the political left who are, against gender politics or against the European Union. So these things don't necessarily align. And then for us as network scientists, we usually don't use the term in our papers, but a social scientist might refer to our network idea of polarization as interactional polarization. So the formation of ideological communities in some network structure and how that correlates with specific political ideologies or identities. And when you talk about interactional polarization, the language that's been very popular in recent years is to start talking about echo chambers. But again, many of these concepts are not so well defined and they can be quite different. So it's, when you find a network structure that looks polarized like this, it's not necessarily obvious whether this is reflecting ideological polarization or issue polarization or something different completely. And then the last two that are worth highlighting is in the US in the last 10 years, people have actually largely stopped talking about ideological polarization and they've started talking about affective polarization. And what affective polarization is actually an emotional form of polarization. It is to do with how positively do you feel towards your own political party, how negatively do you feel towards opposing political parties, and what is the gap between those? So that's what this figure is here in the top right corner. And what this shows is that for the US, these negative attitudes towards your political opponents, so how Democrats feel about Republicans or how Republicans feel about Democrats, this has substantially grown over the last 40 years. And actually, if you look at OECD countries, the US has had the largest increase of this emotional dislike form of polarization in the last 40 years. However, this is a form of polarization, despite it being the dominant form of polarization discussed now in the political science literature. It's almost not mentioned at all by computational social science and network science. We continue to just use the term polarization in general, but we fail to realize that from a social science perspective, these things can have very, very different implications and mean very different things. And one of the classic examples of this is that if you look at the ideological views of Americans on various different issues, ideologically, the US has not really changed very much over the last 40 years. If anything, many Americans are more moderate ideological now than they used to be, but how much they hate the opposition political party is way bigger than it used to be. And these are the kind of nuances which, in my opinion, us as network scientists really have to think more carefully about before we start working in a field that, to be honest, we don't have so much familiarity with usually. Anyway, the last form of polarization I want to mention, by the way, there are way more forms. I just don't have enough time to talk about them all. But one of the fun ones is perceived polarization. And this is similar to emotional polarization in a sense. But the difference here is it's to do with misperceptions. It's about what your opponents actually believe relative to what you think they believe. And this figure here in the bottom right, this is to do with actual perception of how people support climate action against the true perception. And there's this idea that in general, people always overestimate how, negatively their opponents will behave. So they think their opponents are less likely to support climate action than they are in reality and have more negative qualities than they have in reality. But these are all concepts that are super important. Okay, so I've spoken a little bit about, the difficulty of measuring polarization. I've spoken a little bit about the difficulty with different definitions of how we even talk about this phenomenon. And then you get the classic issue, which I have recently had a bit of a vendetta against, which is that if you start actually looking at the polarization literature, almost half of everything you see is just about the US. We talk about polarization as a phenomenon which affects all democracies, because it does affect all democracies. And it also affects autocratic states. Polarization is relevant in a state like Russia. Polarization is relevant in a state like China, even though there's only a single political party. But we need to rethink the language we use to talk about these concepts. And especially from our background in network science, we need to be careful that what we are talking about is, a fair reflection of the nuances of different countries. I should say this is also a figure from work in progress. This will be in a paper that hopefully will come out in a few months. And then the last thing, which is particularly relevant for computational social scientists, is that actually the data sets we use are almost always from social media. And specifically, until recently, they were almost always from Twitter. Our COP paper used Twitter data. The vast majority of major papers on social media and polarization look at Twitter data. Sorry, my doorbell is ringing because it is election day here in the UK, so people are being annoying. I'm going to ignore them. But anyway, so Twitter data is coming. Okay, there are discussions of YouTube, there are discussions of Instagram, but people talk about social media in terms of individual platforms when they exist within an interconnected ecosystem, and individuals flow through this ecosystem in a way that is not random. There are connections between these platforms that are extremely important for understanding whether they can polarize individuals, whether they will drive people to become more radical, whether they facilitate hate speech or not. But many of these connections have historically been ignored, And part of the reason for this is because of this lack of data. So, long story short, what I've been trying to, convince you of is that yes, network scientists can make a real, genuine, major contribution to the understanding of political polarization. But if we're going to do this, we need to have more respect for the literature that already exists from social science. And specifically, we need to actually take more care in being precise about what we measure, explaining what we measure, being honest about what the limitations of the platforms we study are and how those relate to, a classic social science study where they will have, a panel survey, which will be, demographically balanced. And then the last thing is, that it's really important to contextualize our work, not just within the existing papers on network science and polarization, but also in the context of what other social scientists are doing, what other computational social scientists are doing, but also, what communities are doing who haven't used computational methods at all, essentially, some papers in political science, for instance. And yeah, so the discussion I've been giving is mainly in the context of polarization, but a lot of this applies to network science and all other areas of computational social science in general. It's really my opinion that we as a community need to make better efforts to prove to other communities of our value. And part of that is that we need to be more respectful of their work, take on board their insights more. And if we do that, then they will also be more likely to take our work seriously. Okay, so that's the end of me complaining about my own work. I have a few slides on a couple of projects I've been working on recently that try to, use these ideas and, improve our own work using the insights from political science and social science. But I think I'm a little bit short on time. But maybe I just do a 2-minute whistle-stop tour. So, one context we were talking about this recently is in the context of deplatforming. And this is relevant to polarization because we think of platforms like Twitter having, a large number of people from the political left on them, a large number of people from the political right. But it's not necessarily clear how these discussions translate when all the left-wing people move to Mastodon and all the right-wing people move to Gab or Parler or Getter. And one of the things we were interested in is understanding these structures. And we looked actually at data from this platform Getter. This is essentially a clone of Twitter on the political right in the US. And we wanted to understand how the dynamics of political communication are different in this ideologically diverse platform, Twitter, compared to these ideologically homogenous platforms. And the reason we care about this is that many people, especially in the US, but not only, are really worried about pushing people to these fringe platforms, which they see as potentially radicalizing individuals. So yeah, I don't want to talk about this for too long, but we had this nice data set where we were able to match users across both Getter, this right-wing fringe platform, and Twitter. And we were able to show interesting things like those accounts which had been banned from Twitter were much more active on Getter than those accounts which were able to use continue using Twitter. So that's the difference between this blue line and this green line. But one of the things that caught us by surprise is that actually, if you look at the same accounts on Twitter and Getter, so that's if you ignore the orange and the blue, just focus on the green and the dashed brown, these are the exact same accounts, but on two different platforms. So this is on the right-wing fringe platform, this is on Twitter. And we consistently found that users are more toxic towards other accounts on Twitter than they are on Getter. And the question is, why is that? Well, we found that actually part of it is to do with this active communication with political opponents that is possible only on an ideologically diverse platform, but is not possible when you confine yourself to a fringe platform with only a single set of views. And bringing this back to this idea of political polarization and the nuance from political science, one of the things we found is if you look at these right-wing Twitter users and look at who they are predominantly retweeting, so that's on the left, and remember that a retweet is an endorsement, and you look at the people who they interact with but do not endorse, so that's here on the right, you see that there are prominent Republican politicians who are ideologically Republican, but they are treated as if they have a Democrat identity. And this idea of the difference between partisan ideology and partisan identity, that's something that's been really discussed a lot in political science, but has really not been discussed in network science discussions of political polarization. So these are the kind of things we're trying to draw out. And actually, if we look at these different messages, you can see that as you go along the spectrum, so if you interact with people but never retweet them, your messages tend to be significantly more toxic than they would be if it's someone you generally retweet and endorse. And you know, this in computational social science and in computer science, we talked about this in terms of toxicity. But a political scientist would say that this is, in a sense, a signal of affective polarization. You are showing negative animosity towards your political opponents, but not towards your political allies. And it's what we're trying to do with this work is to, you know, bring in these political theory ideas into a network science approach for studying polarization. So that's one study, and then, you know, essentially we did the same thing on Twitter, but for politicians from 9 countries. And again, one of the things you could do is you could, you know, split people ideologically into the political left and right. And we did a lot of work identifying political outliers. So people who belonged to a left-wing political party, but who were identified as being structurally on the political right and vice versa. And again, we saw this pattern that out-group interactions are more toxic than in-group interactions. And that, as a result, is not so surprising to a computer scientist. But framing this in the language of political science, you see that this is, you know, how affective polarization manifests in a social network. And this is currently, I'm working on the revisions for this at the moment. Hopefully it'll be out in a while. Anyway. That's the end of what I wanted to talk about. I've gone on for far too long. Sorry about that. But yeah, thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'd love some questions. And then from the very little bit of time left, maybe we can talk about the joys of fellowship applications.
Thank you, Max. Very, very nice talk. I enjoyed it. Yeah, I enjoyed it a lot. I think there are a lot of things that require some thinking also. Like, I mean, outside like the polarization topic, more on the way us network science sometimes approach other disciplines, like marketing ourselves as a interdisciplinary field. And I think sometimes it requires a bit more work on our side on understanding actually the discipline in which we are trying to get inside somehow.
And I mean, one thing I would say to PhD students in general is that you need to be very careful about this in particular when you're working with an interdisciplinary supervisor, because over time of your PhD, the chances are you will have a better expertise in these areas than your supervisor. And what I realized during my PhD when I was working on cardiology, it took me 2 years to realize that the cardiologist didn't care about what we were doing, our perspective, because we couldn't link it to a clinical way of thinking about cardiology. And, you know, that only came from I only realized that from actually interacting with cardiologists, interacting with bioengineers. You know, if I had only interacted with the network scientists and the physicists I saw every day, you know, maybe I would still be doing this work. But, you know, I think you should be careful about, you know, being aware of your supervisor's own limitations when you're doing interdisciplinary work.
Yeah, I think I think a lot about that, especially I'm not really working at something like interdisciplinary, but like I think a lot. If I had to do that, there are something that are important to consider, and not only focus on like what the network science community does, but also trying to put effort in understanding. For example, if I had to work on biology, I think it's important to focus on the biological community and not focus, on the network science way of doing biology. And I think I don't know, if I had to do something interdisciplinary, I would be very scared somehow in doing something that the other community doesn't care about my work, or doing something that the other community maybe knows from like a very long time, and it's a trivial result from them, but I just reframed a bit the language because I'm a computer science, for example. So this was just some disordered thoughts that I have sometimes. So I was also very interested in your talk because you managed to give me some food for thoughts.
I'm glad. I'm glad.
Hi, yes, I have a few questions for you. First of all, I just wanted to say thank you because I think it was interesting, as you said, that you not only presented your work, but I think you also gave I really like the overview you gave on the topic of polarization in general and sort of what's lacking, especially in the network science community. So I really appreciated that. That was some very interesting insights. And after this very general remark, I had this very much more specific question is, in the last few slides you showed at the end, you treat quoting someone as an sort of an act of as a sign of enmity. Sorry.
You mean this?
Yes, exactly. So because as you said, yeah, it's quite agreed upon that retweeting is endorsement, but I was wondering about quoting. So is there a lot of research on that? I haven't really read about quoting. That's what I was wondering.
So the important detail here is it's not about the quoting. Yeah.
Right.
This works because of this normalization here.
Mm-hmm.
Because what we've done is normalize the quoting by the total number of quotes and retweets.
Yeah.
So the argument here is retweets are almost always endorsements, or at least neutral. You never retweet something you totally disagree with. However, quote tweets can be neutral, they can be positive, or they can be negative. So
okay, I see.
What you're actually doing, this is not about, if you're at this end of the scale, this is not saying that quote tweets are evidence of being an enemy, but if you are heavily quote tweeted by a lot of accounts, but you are never retweeted by the same accounts, that is according to the data we have, so this is the distribution of known Republican politicians on Twitter.
Yeah.
Is the distribution in pink, and the distribution in brown is known Democratic politicians. And this is just empirical data. So if you compute this ratio for a large number of counts, and you see, someone like Nancy Pelosi, who is, really hated by the political right in the US, she is, she has a ratio of 0.95.
Right.
And then you have someone like, Elon Musk, who's nicely here in the middle.
Mm-hmm. So it's not, so you think it doesn't happen that someone is mostly quoted even favorably, like people just quote the tweet saying, oh yeah, great, I really agree with that, and retweet them not very much? Do you think it's rare or that it shouldn't really happen?
I have now done this analysis in several different Twitter data sets, and I've almost never seen an outlier.
Right.
Or more exactly, I've never seen an outlier that doesn't make sense. So like someone like Liz Cheney, she makes sense because she was, one of the two prominent Republicans to say that Trump should have been impeached for January 5th. So even though she's on the political right, you know, the term that Republicans have started using for her is a rhino, a Republican in name only. And the same thing is, so this data set, Tulsi Gabbard was a Democratic politician during our data collection period, and actually she's now defected to the Republicans. But when the data was collected, she was still a Democrat. And in this, you know, here it looks as if she is a Republican.
Okay, I see.
Right. The only exceptions is people who are just like, if there's an account you barely interact with, then there's just not enough data, essentially.
Yeah, of course. Okay.
It only works for accounts who are heavily mentioned, because you know you need this balance of noise.
Right. Okay, great. Thank you very much.
No, thank you. Thank you for the question.
Okay, I think we can move on with the discussion part.
Yeah, so so I discussed this with Sylvia, and Sylvia suggested that maybe I talk about a little bit about fellowship applications. Partially because, well, I got one. I got a Marie Curie fellowship. That's what I have to go to Vienna. And one of the things I thought would be interesting to talk about is, you know, strategically choosing what you write your fellowship application about. And I think this is extremely relevant for network scientists, because there are a large number of network scientists who've had big problems getting grant money. And I think that's especially true of people who are doing more theoretical network science than it is of people working in applied networks. So I know 5 people who have gotten Marie Curie fellowships, and 3 of them have worked on climate-related issues. And this, I don't think that is a coincidence. You know, my proposal was related to climate change, and I did that deliberately because that is the kind of thing that couldn't get funded. And I think, you know, it is naive of you to write a fellowship application about something you just like if it's not strategic. The reality is, once you have the money, then you can spend 50% of your time doing, you know, purely, in my case, you know, climate related stuff. But of course, you can always work on side projects that you like. You know, I like doing stuff to do with network models, which, you know, which are not stationary in time. I find that interesting, but I'm never going to get a fellowship working on that. I will get a fellowship working on networks of climate polarization, because all of those things are, you know, very buzzword heavy, very grant application friendly. And yeah, so I think that is a useful perspective. And then, you know, then there's all sorts of, you know, basic things which, you know, pitfalls and mistakes you should be careful not to make when you write these things. But, you know, I can talk about them more or not, whatever people prefer.
Okay. Yeah, I found this very related to what we were discussing before on, like, I think it's important to try, I mean, in general, to find problems that people care about. In general, if you work on interdisciplinary application, I think this is important, because if you have another community as a reference, you want to work on at least problems that they care about. But also, I think this relates with grant application. If you need to try to find problems that people care about, and not only maybe it's interesting for the network science community. That, I mean, it's important, but things can, I think one should have like a broad picture of what is trying to do, and not only focus on our conferences. Yeah. So I was thinking about this when you were like talking about your thoughts on this grant application. I'm in my PhD, so that I don't have experience in applying for grants, but yeah, this was my.
Yeah, but everyone, if you choose to stay in academia, everyone has to write their first application at some point. And I've written several applications where I was rejected, and I've applied to several permanent jobs and was rejected. That's part of the reality. But when a field is as competitive as what we are doing, and every time you want to go one step up the ladder, it gets harder and harder. Then if you do, it's your own fault if you don't think about these things strategically. And I mean, specifically, for things like Marie Curie, if people are interested in applying, by all means, please, please, please reach out to people who have been successful. When I wrote mine, I had 3 or 4 different former applications which I used to help build mine, and make it look structurally correct, make the language work, fit everything in. And then I had like 5 different people read it, including multiple people who sit on EU grant panels. Just you need to make use of these people.
Nice. Thank you for sharing your experience. I think it's very nice to have like this perspective also shared in that place in which usually we have like audience of more PhD students, and usually PhD students like on their way for postdocs. So this can be very, very useful for our small community of net placers. So if there are any questions, otherwise we can say goodbye. And like,
thank you very much for the invitation. I hope it was interesting for you.
Yeah, of course. I find it very, very interesting, both like the more science and discussion part. A lot of food for thought. So thank you very much for participating. Thank you everybody for joining us, and we hope to see you again at next seminars of NetPlace.
Thank you all. Thanks all for coming, and thanks for the invitation.
Thank you, Max, and thank you everybody. Bye.
Bye.